President Zelensky himself actually said overnight in his nightly address that Western-supplied air defense systems, including the US-built Patriot and Germany's Iris-T, have been proving highly effective. How important to Ukraine is it that the West keeps supplying this military equipment?
Well, it's interesting because with all the discussion about F-16 fighters and latest generation long-range missiles, very quietly, the pipeline continues with your javelins and with the Stingers and with the NASAMS and now Patriots. And so the Ukrainians have developed a rather formidable multi-layered defense that covers most of low and medium altitude and some high altitude Russian aircraft and missiles. So when the Russian manned aircraft come low, like Su-25s or something like that, ground attack, they're coming in on a hornet's nest of usually well placed short range missiles, and then they come in higher, and you've got NASAMS and now Patriots and a whole bunch of other systems. This is what we call integrated air defense. And they've got that. And it has spooked the Russian pilots. They don't fly low that often. I think that is what gave the Ukrainians hope and confidence that they could continue their ground offensive without high-level aircraft interceptors like the F-16 and others, that because of their very, very capable low to medium range anti-aircraft, they could keep the Russians off their back. That's been somewhat successful, but in the end, the Ukrainians are going to need more aircraft wings, if you will, as well. No, the air defense has been superb. I saw it in action when I was in Kyiv 2 months ago, one night when Patriots were taking down Kinzhal missiles, the vaunted Kinzhal hypersonic. They shot 6 of them down the first time they were deployed. And a number of us were in the center of Kyiv and woken up to the flash and bang of all of this. And so, no, it's ugly, it's hard. The Ukrainians are exhausted. It's relentless, but they have been able to keep most of the airspace over the battlefields manageable, but not enough, because Russian aircraft do get through in the current operating environment. But that's the air defense piece of all this is a success story. Though incomplete, Russian missiles and cruise missiles and drones do get in, but always the majority seemingly get shot down.
And how do you say this stacks up compared to Moscow's air defenses, as we've seen a series of drone strikes, possibly by Kiev over the last few weeks? During the mutiny by Wagner forces, some commentators said that the Kremlin was effectively unable to defend itself. Do you think that's accurate?
Well, it's where we look. I mean, the so-called at one time vaunted Russian air defense system, also integrated, has been shown to have a lot of seams. It hasn't been tested like this in recent memory. And they have a lot of difficulty coordinating acquisition to decision to launch, whether low level, mid level, or high level. So Ukrainian missiles and seemingly drones do penetrate Russian airspace, and in most cases get through to their target. And you see that both on the battlefield. The Russian low level, again, their low level anti-air is pretty effective. saying that Ukrainians have been able to get in and hit things with air to ground as well, but the air battle, the anti-air battle over the front where the troops are battling it out, just a mile away from each other or less, um, is quite contested.
Recently, Times correspondent George Grills visited a Ukrainian military hospital near the front, where he reports that around 40%, including some people who have had limbs amputated, are returning to the front after treatment for war injuries. How important do you think the will of Ukrainian people and soldiers has been in this war?
Well, what does that tell you? It tells us that the Ukrainians want to get into the fight. When I again was in with a delegation 6 weeks ago, what we found, we hear it out in the West and everything. You go there, and whether it is the farmer in the countryside or a senior government official, this nation is completely, it is a societal fight that the Ukrainians are fighting the Russians. The entire society is fighting the Russians. They never imagined that the Ukrainians would mobilize both the people and the will, getting your very, very important point, to fight. And when they came over the border, they ran into a buzzsaw, which firmed up and became dramatic when Zelensky became forgive, I know we're speaking to the British here, but positively Churchillian in his persona, in his statements, his bravery, his looking the foe in the eye, calling it as he is. Everybody underestimated him. So you couple all that, the will to fight, meaning these soldiers that have been wounded, the fact that they want to go back into the fight. This is happening at every level of the population and whatever the endeavors. They're exhausted. That's a key point, but they're going to stay at it. And when the young Russian troops are over the border and they're fighting in the Donbass and elsewhere, they're fighting mostly for their own survival. But the will to fight is not about their cause. It's just to survive. They are better, though. The Russians have improved. But the Ukrainian will, its moxie, their intellectual nimbleness in how to manage things, their flexibility has been, I think, a case study, a remarkable case study for all of us to see, and it'll be written up in the history books from years ago. But it is a desperate fight. It isn't for the Ukrainians. This is an existential fight. And I'll leave on one point, Lewis, here. I believe there are two existential fights going on, big ones, big level. One is the existence of a free-minded Ukrainian sovereign nation. That looks like it's going to happen. The other existential fight that's directly tied to the fate of Ukraine is the actual regime of Vladimir Putin. And that is also an existential fight inside his regime. If they fail or lose in Ukraine, that regime will go down.
And so, nevertheless, Ukraine's counteroffensive is continuing, arguably at a slower pace than some had anticipated, and perhaps the West had hoped. The latest we're hearing from that is that Ukraine has destroyed 2 key bridges in the southern region of Kherson and in Crimea. How important do we think these logistical attacks could be if Ukraine does choose a southern region like Kherson or Zaporizhzhia for a push south?
Well, I think it's very important. I think that what the Ukrainians have seen, and it's been, everybody who's been paying attention realized this is going to be a hard fight. This counteroffensive, it was the most advertised counteroffensive in history, which, by the way, drove the Ukrainians crazy when we were there, because, I mean, when you're trying to plan an operation, the whole world's looking over your shoulder. That's hard. They are in it. The grinded out offensive through deep Russian positions has been harder even than all thought, but this has been, certainly thought about. And the Ukrainians, what they've also shown is they adapt. By the way, the Russians are adapting too, and we can't forget that. If there's anything about war, is that if you don't adapt, you die, and both sides are adapting. And the Ukrainians, as they did in Kherson, good God, that was, we're approaching a year ago. They are now increasingly hitting Russian logistics, bridges, the interconnected points back behind Zaporizhia and Kherson, hitting Crimea, hit the Kerch Bridge again, which is also a prestige hit for the Russians, and trying to, and with these attacks, I believe, to wear down the Russian, getting at your question, the Russian will to fight. There's a breaking point out there somewhere. And if there's a will to fight breaking point, it'll be a Russian one. They haven't shown that, but we're seeing it all from the Ukrainian side. But this is a very tough fight for the Russians and how long they can sustain it. And this is not popular among the Russian soldiers. Now, it isn't popular for the Ukrainian soldiers. They don't want to go fight and die, but they believe in their cause. And what is that breaking point? I think that's a lot what people have been counting on is where, when, like we saw in Kyiv last year, like we saw at Kharkiv last year, and then where is the Russian melting point? Where do they break? And if they break in a part of the front, there's the hole, there's the seam, and then the remaining reserves possibly exploit that. That is, I think, the intent, the attacks behind the line against logistics, as I said, and I also think that they're spooking the Russians in Crimea. We're reading about a lot of Russians leaving and wanting to leave, and in some ways isolating Crimea. To think that there was, for a while, that the Russians were sending tourists still down there. So will to fight, number one. The long-range materiel, critical. The Ukrainians are in desperate need of artillery rounds, primarily 155 artillery rounds, which is in part the decision to go with the scatterable munitions, because they're firing stocks, both sides, World War I dimensions.
We've also seen, speaking of Crimea and also the Black Sea, in a slightly larger picture, we've seen several naval drone attacks in the Black Sea, and Russia coming back with attacks on Ukrainian grain ports. What do you think the impact is going to be in this war if Ukraine can open a sort of naval drone bombing campaign of sorts in the Black Sea?
Well, Russia, first of all, I think that hitting the grain facilities, there may be a strategic notion that they're going to break them because they're going to take their, but this doesn't play well to the world that needs grain. And so by pulling out of the grain deal and then striking the Ukrainian ability to get grain out to the world, it may hurt, if you will, Ukrainian revenue, but it diminishes the Russian position worldwide. So I think that they work against each other. And I mean, they have some partners, non-aligned partners, but they're still fence sitters that can't be happy about the grain situation. But it's happening, and they're working to try to isolate the Ukrainians through bombing and missiles and all of that from the Black Sea, which they haven't been able to do on the ground. Last year, it looked like they really were going for Odessa. It didn't happen. And then they got rolled back at Kherson. So the Black Sea is a critical front. And then now we're watching, again, this agility, this flexibility, the ability to change the narrative and the focus. The fact that they hit a couple days ago one of those very formidable Rapucha class amphibious support vessels, which is a warship that kicks out all kinds of amphibious troops and things, Marines. And nobody knows exactly the status of that. And then they hit a tanker. They, by the way, destroyed one of those Rapucha ships last year in Berdyansk, also on the Black Sea of Azov. So, and in last April, they sank the cruiser Moskva, which was a calamitous thing for the Russians. So what the Ukrainians are doing is, and they took back Snake Island, and Zelensky got on Snake Island in a big photo op, basically doing this to the Russians, So the Black Sea has become really difficult. And the fact that, they're hitting now ports on the Russian mainland, Novorossiysk, which I've been to. It's all the way on the other side. And the fact that they're in there is very disconcerting for the Russians. And I think in part may be part of a strategy to slowly just choke off Crimea. Don't know if it'll happen, but the Ukrainians have, again, with their nimbleness and agility to do all this, it's opened, if you will, or continue to keep open a festering front for the Russians. We all worried in the beginning the Russians are going to do big invasions out of the Black Sea to the Ukrainian coast, and that just hasn't happened.
And last night you mentioned the international response to Russia's attack on grain and pulling out of the Black Sea grain deal. Of course, last night we saw a second round of peace talks come to an end in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. Moscow weren't invited to these talks, but China were, as were a lot of these nations you say that sat on the fence. Now China is backing the notion of a third round of talks on the possibility of peace. How important do you think that pressure on Russia and especially on Putin from China could be?
Well, it's an oblique way, potentially, for China to put pressure on Russia through the auspices of this group without having to do it directly. Because the Chinese and the Russians do have their partnership. We just saw them flying or sailing their ships near Alaska the other night. So I think China's playing a careful game. It wants to be seen as constructive. It's been active in the Middle East with its diplomacy, as we know. And what is interesting in this group is that the Ukrainians were there. And so were, as you said, the Chinese, the Indians were there, the South Africans, most of the BRICS were there except for Russia. And I don't know what it'll amount to, because in the end, the Ukrainians are not going to support a negotiation that does not meet their needs. And that means they want to get their country back. And not something in between, which would then be treated in Moscow as a victory. So I don't know, but there is a dialogue. The Ukrainians were there. The Russians were not there. The Chinese and Indians and a whole bunch of other countries were there. And it's also showing the Middle East and Saudi Arabia and UAE, they're increasingly assertive and independent foreign policy. And while there's been a lot of flirtation with Russia, there has been, It hasn't been boundless.
And so, if we could come on to your book, Swimming in the Volga, um, you've revealed in your book that you do actually have quite a long history with Russia, having lived in the Tver region north of Moscow. Can you take us through the time that you lived there and how it shaped your understanding of Russia and its people?
No, thank you for your question. Yes, I am. I'm schizophrenic about the Russians. There's a side of me, and you get that from the book. And I was out among the Russians as a young student. I was a young army captain during the Glasnost that got permission to study, both from the Soviet authorities and my own side in the U.S. military, to go with the U.S. college group in this provincial city in 1989, 2 years before the fall of the Soviet Union. Glasnost and perestroika around, but nobody imagined that the Soviet Union was going to break up at that time. And there was a hopefulness, and there was an opening. It was still the Soviet Union, but we were there, and there were a couple of other Army officers that had the same experiences in other places. It was a fascinating summer. Improved my Russian. I was able to meet everybody from students, young Komsomol guys that change, teachers, young business entrepreneurs that some become just local businessmen, others become big black marketeers, kids, and you get a sense of the society on the side of the Volga. And what the story was, swimming the Volga, was that we would go with our Russian counterparts or students at Moscow, at Clinton State University, and we would swim across the Volga. At that point, it was about 300 yards wide, and so this summer was one that put a lot of history, World War II history, and all of that. But it imbued in me a sense of the Russians. Now, I'm an old Cold War, ex-Cold War Army officer. And I've become a Cold Warrior 2 other times. One in 2014 after that, the first invasion. And let's face it, we're basically there now. But it helped me open my mind. I went back to that city 8 more times between 1989, that summer, the Soviet Union collapses, between then and 1999. And that is, and the book covers that on a very human level through the eyes of Russian citizens and people. The creaking and the groaning and the hopes and aspirations and the sadness and the failures and broken dreams of the 1990s in a provincial city in Russia, which is a mirror image of what was going on. I call it the lost decade, because there was some hope, significant hope, both within Russia and our collective Western world, that Russia was going to come more into, if you will, the mainstream community of nations and be a peaceful contributor. You can point fingers at what happened in the 90s, but the opportunity was lost. And then later, I'm an Army combat intelligence officer. I remain in the Army, and then much later, I become a foreign area officer, and I get asked if I wanted to serve as our defense attache to Moscow from 2012 to 2014, which is the period of the first invasion. And the last part of the book is and a little bit in the introduction, is I come back to this town, Kalinin, now called Tver, and as our senior military official in Russia, and trying to remember back then and now, I'm furious at the Russians for their invasion in 2014. Yes, I can understand aspects of it, but it's completely wrong. And how I evolved from this, this book gave me the underpinnings to try to get inside the Russian mind. I will never understand the Russian mind. You try to, but you don't unless you live in their skin. It's impossible. But all of this helped me in my later career regarding the military and post-career as a writer and analyst on this. My last point on this is that, as I said, I have a certain affinity, appreciation for the Russian people and their culture, but I'm implacably on the side of the Ukrainian desire fight for a free-minded sovereign state, which is why I've taken the public positions. This is what makes me schizophrenic.
And so, as you say, you went back several times throughout the 1990s after your initial stay there in the 80s. How do you think that change that you describe in the book, how do you think that led to the kind of Russia we see today on the world stage, but also as a nation?
That's a great question, Louis. I went back 8 times between 99 up to 99. That's when Putin comes in. By the way, we don't even see Putin coming. Most of the world doesn't see it happening. And then as an army officer, I'm still traveling in Russia in the 2000s, mostly independently as a tourist, but also when I was in U.S. Army Europe, I went in on some missions to meet Russian counterparts. First, I will not blame the West for. It's easy to say it's West's fault that Russia became back to what it was or whatever. I believe it is this is a collective loss. A lot of effort. And I was in NATO and others and the government to work to bring the Russians in. But maybe in retrospect, worldwide or in the West, it was clumsy or maybe not well coordinated, but it was there. But within Russia, you had a entrepreneur class that became oligarchs. You had former KGB that became power brokers. You had all this other stuff that's going on that hijacked. And I saw it with the devaluations and the industries changing and the wages failing and the disillusionment of the mainstream Russian population. That back when I was there in 1980, swimming the Volga, it was, freedom, democracy. We're going to make money, all of these things, Pink Floyd, and there was a dissolution. Now, toward the end of the 90s, you had Kosovo, you had Chechnya going on, and then in Kosovo in 99, which I do believe was necessary because there was a genocide going on there, but this was done outside the auspices of the United Nations, which Russia was going to block it on the Security Council. But I do believe the mission to do Kosovo by Europe was the right one. But they were furious about that. And then you, of course, this is toward the end of Yeltsin's period. You come into Putin, and Russia at this point is getting increasingly harder. There was a potential thaw with 9/11. And then we intervened in Iraq. That pissed the Russians off. Russians were doing their own things in a lot of different places, and relations just continued to go down and down. But there was in government where I was, there was no calculus to take down Russia, not at all. And NATO enlargement was huge in 1999. That's when Poland and Hungary and Czech Republic came in, and the Russians will say to this day this was a Western plot from the beginning. And I can tell you that there was a lot of agonization. It took 8 years to get those countries into NATO. It wasn't that at all. But from a Russian view, oh my God, they're advancing the alliance east But then again, we've got to remember, and every time you're in Russia, you see it when you go out to the war memorials and the grave sites. The Nazis came from the West, and 20 to 26 Soviets die, many of them Ukrainians and Belarusians. So there is so much historical baggage. You get a strong leader that is into dominating the narrative, and you start to point threats and victimization, and you had that going on regarding the West. And there's a colossal grievance narrative now that goes on with the West. We were not at times always artful, but there was a major effort to bring Russia into the collective fold. And that I do believe, and that I know.
And many of the average Russians you spoke to at the time, you talk about this kind of belief that even if it doesn't happen to them, there is going to eventually be a better world for their children if they can stick it out and keep supporting the regime through the tumultuous 90s. Do you think many Russians still believe this today, and would continue to support Putin under those auspices, or do you think things have changed now?
I've seen pretty deeply into the Russians. I'll never forget, and I wrote about in the book, I'm on a train. I travel the trains a lot, these old electric trains, but that they were the commuter backbone. And I ended up with a Russian Stalingrad veteran in 1996, and this is on the eve of the 1996 election, and that's Yeltsin running against Zhuganov and the Communist Party and others. And we got to politics somehow, and the Russians are cagey about it, but they talked about this stuff a lot, and that was the big news. And he said, well, sir, who are you going to vote for? I'm going to Yeltsin. And I would have thought that he might have gone with the old hardcore communist guy. And why, sir? I'm voting for my grandchildren, and that was a very, very revealing statement. Meaning, my time has passed. I'm voting for a better Russia for my grandchildren. I have seen enough of the Russian people on the ground that I know that a lot of them are deeply troubled by the information that has been wafting up, whether through the wounded and maimed soldiers coming home, or others that disappear, and the rumors, and the Russians do have an internet, and now Putin has been able to firewall it for the first year, but now obvious demonstrations that they're into much more than a special military operation. They're in a war, and which is double-edged, because while he still calls it that operation, they're able to inculcate in the Russians, who are first and foremost patriotic, no matter where or how or what their belief system is, that they've got to fight for their nation. Their nation is under siege. And the regime has been building these tropes from the Second World War, Mother Russia, and Ukraine, and trying to throw the Nazi tag on Ukraine, which is ridiculous. You had strands of that in different places, but no, that is not the Ukrainians with their Jewish president. But it works well, Louis, in the Russian narrative. My feeling is that I remember when I was there in '89, the fallout from Afghanistan was still coming from the Soviet intervention invasion in Afghanistan. The mothers came out. Mothers have been out during this war. It's going to take time. I believe that there are two battles against time. One is the Ukrainians just grimly, toughly hanging in there and reposting and pushing back where they can. The other battle against time is the Putin regime against a dealing with eventually a Russian population that snapped not once but twice viciously in the 20th century, 1917 and '89. What's the breaking point if this war goes on indefinitely? Because the word is filtering out. I'll stop on this one. I believe the Russian people One, they desperately want to believe in their nation, Mother Russia, Rossiya. Number two, they desperately want to believe in their president, their leadership. I think that's shakier, though Putin has been out and about more. He's been more leadership. He's lately. Two, desperately want to believe in their leader. Three, they desperately want to believe in the messaging and the narrative. And I think that they've got some doubts. And most of all, they desperately don't want to believe all the horrible news they're hearing coming up from the battlefront and permeating through the internet. I think there's a massive collective denial. That means, a little bit like Vietnam era in the United States. You had a large percentage of the population, didn't like the war, but my country, right or wrong. And I think we have that aspect going on. But we just see the signs of a really unhealthy regime, the infighting, the biting, the Prigozhin raid, generals talking at each other, assassinations. It's not healthy. And I think something could eventually snap.
And in your book, you do address this further to the end of the book. You sort of posit this question: will we be dealing with Vladimir Putin after 2024? Do you think the events of the past 2 years have made that more or less likely in your mind?
Well, yes, we have two big elections in 2024. We have the Russian in March, and he will, if he runs, he will, I'm sure in some way he will win. He could also declare, that we're in a military crisis and get the Duma to keep him in power. I don't know what will happen. But in 20, I think there are a large percentage of the population are tired of the war. We remember in 2011, 2012, when they tried to gerrymander the election presidency and prime minister between Medvedev, who's been very noisy lately, and Putin. Back then, tens of thousands went into the streets, what they call the Bolotnaya protests and everything else. So it's there. Now, what Putin has done, the regime, is they have really smothered resistance and very aggressively. So it would take something big to bring it all out at once on the street. So you've got that. And your other question, I'm sorry, Lewis.
No problem. Yes, do you think that we will be dealing with Putin still after 2024?
Well, I think that, we all wondered if he was sick. I mean, the man is 70. He's been under a lot of stress, but he has been, after isolating himself, out pressing the flesh lately, if you've seen. I mean, he's out there. He finally realized you got to get out of your bunker. And that's what Prigozhin did. And get out there and among the people. And he's been down in Dagestan, and he's been in Kronstadt on the Baltic near St. Petersburg. He was in Moscow shaking hands. He's more aggressive after disappearing for about 16 months. And I think there is a understanding that he needed to get out. The question is, it's he and his inner circle. Do they believe that they can? I'm so sorry. Do they believe that they can sustain, move beyond 24 without him? One big difference between 2024 and the past is that Putin has they can, the old line, you can't paint lipstick on a pig, but has embarked Russia on a colossally screwed up, challenged war. To the point, with all of this bluster about NATO and that what would it take of an action, an aggression, to bring Finland and Sweden into NATO, two fiercely, up till now, neutral nations? I think that was huge. And what he has done, Putin, in his disdain to the Ukrainians. He has created with the Russian regime a hyper-patriotic Ukrainian state that they never imagined, that is now an implacable foe that will take generations to reconcile with. So and he has completely cut, the bulk of his energy linkages with Europe. And this is all strategically really ugly. And lastly, it's almost pathetic in a way, submissive to the Chinese, and a supplicant even to the North Koreans. The image of the Russian Minister of Defense 2 weeks ago in Pyongyang during this war was fascinating.
Brigadier General Peter Zwack, thank you very much for your time today.
Hey, listen, the honor's mine. You're great allies, and hopefully this was credible.
Thank you very much.
All the best to you.